As Sarah mentioned, I'm a historian, mostly of the Atlantic region. I've been spending the last couple of years really focusing on West Africa, and specifically on the palm oil industry and palm kernels as well, which is a secondary product of palm oil production. And if you pay much attention to news, especially environmental news, you should know lots about palm oil. It's an incredibly important part of the economic life for a lot of people in Southeast Asia, in Western Africa, and it's becoming increasingly important in Latin America as well. And as my title suggests, people have been working on the problems of making oil efficiently for a really long time. I've found at least 175 years of inventors coming up with brilliant machines to make palm oil efficiently, better than traditional hand-powered processes. And as you may guess from the 175 years, they haven't worked all that well. And what I'm going to talk about today are really two interrelated issues with design, and specifically machine design. One is the purpose. What is the end goal of a design? Who is it designed to serve? And how do you figure out what the person it's designed to serve wants? And the other factor is scale. How far in or out does your design need to look in terms of coming up with appropriateness for a specific device? And this talk is sort of my thinking through an article that I'm working on about this thing, which I came across in the archives in Accra, in Ghana, last year. It is a fairly simple diagram for a machine for processing palm oil. And it really caught my attention because it was invented by a Ghanaian, by somebody from the city of Cape Coast. It was, I'm not entirely sure, but probably European educated in engineering. But he designed this, and a lot of people were really excited about it because they thought that an African inventor might have more insights into the kinds of machines an African palm oil producer might use. And the inventor himself said he made this machine for the African oil manufacturer who, having no scientific training, cannot very well use the palm oil extracting machines, which have hitherto been invented. So I was really excited to find this. There's a couple years of correspondence where different institutes are testing this machine, different business people are experimenting with it, and it disappears. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. And so this got me thinking about how long people have been trying to make these machines and why they've been so unsuccessful. So my geographical focus here today is on West Africa. The oil palm, the tree that produces palm oil, is indigenous to West Africa as well as the forests of Western Africa down the coast here. I'm focusing on West Africa, and specifically the Anglophone countries, modern-day Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And I'm focusing on these in part because they were part of an interconnected network. In the case of Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Nigeria, the British Empire, and Liberia, this English-speaking world that had a lot of exchange of ideas. They were selling the same products to the same markets. And so they have a lot in common, even though there's a huge amount of ethnic and environmental diversity across this region. And the palm oil business in West Africa began in the 19th century. The first recorded exports come from about 1806, I think, in the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade. And it's a product that was probably excess from household production. People use oil palm in West Africa for food. They process it and consume it relatively quickly, within a couple weeks, maybe a few months at the maximum. And the oil that they're exporting was usually not edible by the time it reached its destinations in Europe and North America. It spent several months sitting in a cask on a boat, and so it was used mostly for soap. And this is a real contrast to edible palm oil, which you can buy. This is not West African palm oil, but you can buy this at the co-op. It comes from, I think this is from Ecuador, maybe. And it's a different species of palm than most, or different variety of the palm species. But Anyway, you can buy it, taste it, it's wonderful, it's great. But the industry began at a very small level, households mostly, producing palm oil, initially for their own consumption, and then discovering export opportunities, ability to earn money by selling palm oil. And a lot of people got to thinking about how can we make more palm oil. And I picked this title, 175 Years, because the oldest example of this thinking that I have is from Liberia in the 1840s. And this is from a publication in the Maryland Colonization Journal, which, if you're not familiar, Liberia was a colony of former slaves from the United States, and the state of Maryland sponsored one of these colonies. And so somebody working with this project was writing for an American audience, calling for new machines to really expand this industry, realizing that it's incredibly labor intensive and that a few machines that multiply people's labor could dramatically expand exports. And this author said, we cannot but doubt that this oil will form one of the heaviest articles of traffic in the commercial world. And he's exaggerating a bit, but there's a lot of potential here. And throughout the 1840s and 50s, there's evidence of people trying to import foreign machines, usually European-designed machines that do something. Mostly it's squish the oil in something resembling an apple press or a grape wine press. And these machines are not very successful. And it's not because they're bad at squishing fruit. They're really quite adequate at doing that. They're not successful, it seems, because they're too expensive, and there's really not much need for them in a society that has access to labor. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the dynamics of labor in a minute. And I say these machines didn't succeed. It's also not because people weren't interested in them. From 1852 in Liberia, we have one of the colonists writing that he imported one of these presses, and he says, the local people look upon the machine, though simple, when in operation, and frequently they indulge in expressions of ridicule at their own imperfect methods of making oil. Many of them have inquired the price of a similar press and declared their intention to purchase. So we have lots of examples of entrepreneurs in Africa who see machines as possibly good things. They're excited about them. They're not culturally conservative. They're not afraid of machines. And those who have money do buy these machines. But as I said, they're really expensive. And I won't get into the numbers here. I'll just say expensive. Too expensive for most people to even really consider. And so, despite lots of new presses and other contraptions coming out, most palm oil is still made by hand. In fact, the biggest innovation that happens in the 19th century is this process that's depicted over here on the left, which is making palm oil that is designed to be inedible. And it's an incredible labor-saving process. To make edible palm oil, you have to cook palm fruit fairly quickly, to prevent the breakdown of the fatty material. This process to make so-called hard oil didn't cook the fruit at all. The fruit is allowed to basically ferment for several weeks, and then people stomp on it in a trough or an old canoe, and they can do this at a much larger scale than the so-called soft oil process, which involves gathering fruit, putting it in a pot, boiling it for a while, mashing it up, squeezing out the oil, boiling the oil to separate the water, and so on. So the hard palm oil process, I argue, is a really great invention. It is a technological system that was brand new. It served absolutely no purpose in these societies before the advent of the palm oil trade. It was something that they came up with to meet this new demand. And it was very successful in saving labor. It's somewhere between 3 and 5 times more efficient in terms of labor than the cooking process. So it's a great invention. But by the 20th century, manufacturers who are buying this oil don't want the hard oil. They want the soft oil because there are new markets opening up for things like margarine and other baking fats. And so there's a lot of pressure from outside manufacturers to make edible oil, which means that they need to find a way to speed up this cooking process as well as this whole extraction process overall. And And by the way, these great pictures are from a book that the Gold Coast colonial government published right before Ghana became independent, trying to educate people about better ways of making palm oil. And some of these outside investors, outside companies, and colonial governments that were beginning to occupy this region in the early 20th century focused on small machines. The idea is that people can't afford big, steam-powered, machine-driven devices, and so small technology that uses lots of labor but magnifies it in some way. That's the way to improve quality and volume. There are a few people who argue that the opposite direction is where you need to go. You need to scale up. In fact, they argued that in most West African societies, labor was not plentiful, but was actually rather scarce. And so the more machines you can use, the better. And the problem with this, and this is an example of one of these small milling operations, is that it costs even more money. It's an order of magnitude bigger than a simple oil press. And so this is out of the reach of all but a small handful of West Africans. And I'll point out there are 2 or 3 Nigerians who do buy plants like this and set them up as entrepreneurs. But generally speaking, these are out of reach. And the problem that entrepreneurs quickly discovered with these mills is that they're technically incredibly efficient, but they're only efficient if you can keep feeding fruit into them. And what some of the big manufacturers, especially what became modern-day Unilever, discovered was that they couldn't reliably buy enough fruit. People using the traditional process could make more money making oil the hard way than they could selling fruit to one of these mills. There's a great example from Sierra Leone where one of these factory owners got together 1 ton of palm fruit in a giant heap and said, "I'll pay you," the number's 30 shillings for this. And the local people got together, they got their own pile, the same size, turned it into oil, and found that the oil was worth 40 shillings. And so, even though they had to invest a lot more labor in making the oil, they got more money for it. And the assumption that underlies these big mills is that the labor saved by mechanizing the process has another productive outlet. It can find other ways of making money. You can essentially create a wage labor society. And across West Africa, this is not the case. People who work full-time bringing fruit to these mills find that they're not earning as much per day as they did the old-fashioned way, making oil. And in interest of time, I won't get too far into numbers here, but basically these don't work. And they are all sorts of attempts, big plants, small plants, medium plants. There are a few government-subsidized plants, especially in what is now Ghana, that are set up. And they even try to save as much money as possible on capital by recycling equipment, repurposing things, making as much locally as they can. And they still can't get enough fruit. And so the conclusion for many investors who wanted to build these mills is that the mill has to come with the plantation. That the technology is not just squishing fruit. The technology is control of the entire production process. And this is exactly what happens in Southeast Asia. The industry that develops there in Indonesia and Malaysia is plantation-based for the most part. And it involves plantations that the mill itself owns and can hire workers to harvest that fruit just for the plantation. These experimental mills rely on people to harvest their own trees and bring the fruit in, and they find that people just don't want to do it because it's not profitable enough. And so this one mill that opened in eastern Ghana, for instance, in a place called Bukanor, works for 2 or 3 years. Even with the subsidy, it can't make a profit, and so it's shut down, and it's actually shipped back to Sierra Leone, where it originally came from, for another failed experiment. And throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s, there are just mountains of reports of agricultural experts predicting that people just need time to learn how much money they can make by working in these mills, working as wage laborers. And they don't really seem to be learning the point here. And it's just an example of how fruit is transported. The traditional method continues to be competitive well into the 1960s in many parts of West Africa. And it's competitive because people were, I don't want to say willing, but worked for the equivalent of very low wages to use very low-tech production systems in order to keep 100% of the proceeds of the oil-making process. If they were to sell fruit to a large commercial mill, they may only get 50% of the total value of the fruit, the oil value of the fruit, for 50% of the work, but there's no guarantee that that 50% of work that's saved can do something else to make money. So people consistently choose to spend more time making oil the hard way to get more money from it. I have similar examples of this in the palm kernel industry, which was largely a women's business, and the coconut industry, which is sort of a related tree crop. And people, I'll just briefly mention palm kernels are especially interesting because they're irregularly shaped, they're very hard nuts in the middle of the palm fruit. And according to the FAO, a fairly recent study, there's still not a perfect machine for cracking these nuts. It's a very complicated process, and what determines the success or failure of these machines is how reliable people want them to be. And in the case of kernels, the reliability is how many nuts does it crack versus leave uncracked, and how many nuts does it completely pulverize. And in some countries that were willing to accept 80 or 90% of successfully cracked nuts, that was good enough. But for somebody cracking by hand, they have something like a 99.5% success rate in cracking. And so it's incredibly labor intensive, but the quality is much higher. And again, this individual keeps 100% of the earnings. If they bring their nuts to a machine, they pay a fee to use it, or they perhaps sell the nuts altogether to somebody who keeps revenue from that process. So, sort of get down to the end here. The other factor I'm going to talk about is scale generally. I have examples from a number of places in West Africa where people, by the 1940s and 50s, wanted technology, but opted not to use it for largely economic reasons. Either the machines themselves are too expensive, or they're worried that if they invest in machines, much larger changes will happen in the global economy. So for instance, in the 1940s, there are women who crack kernels by hand, but pay to use a machine to grind them up into powder to make kernel oil. And they're not willing to buy their own kernel crackers to mechanize the whole process because they're worried about cheap imports showing up any day. They have no control over national trade policy, and so they're not going to invest in something that might be worthless the next day if foreign imports suddenly show up. There's a great case in Nigeria in 1946 where women are protesting one of these large mills that's going up because the mill will deny them access to palm kernels, which are their main source of income. And they propose that, in fact, this government-run mill not be run by the government, but in fact be run by a women's cooperative. They say, we'll stop protesting it if you let us buy it. We'll pay it back over many, many years. And the government said no, because they don't think women's cooperatives should be running giant factories. Wrapping things up here. I'm not really sure what my conclusion is, except that the palm oil industry and the related palm kernel industry is complicated. There are social dynamics, particularly with the gendering of labor. Operating machinery like a press is generally seen as men's work, whereas processing kernels is traditionally seen as women's work. And these two groups have very different access to capital, the money to buy machines or to use machines. And the adoption of things like this, screw press, or more recently, expeller presses that are also hand-powered, has gradually crept up. There's not really good numbers to say how many of them there are, but they are gradually working. They're working in places where other economic activity has made them viable, where people do have alternative outlets for labor, and where the time you save by using this machine can be profitably used doing something else. So I'll stop there, talking too long, and turn it over to Laura.